Hello and welcome in to another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the Timberwolves are ninth in FanDuel's NBA Finals odds to win the championship this year. Am I taking crazy pills or is that way too low? I'll explain why next.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend. Today on the show, we're going to talk all things championship odds. The Timberwolves are far too low in FanDuel's odds to win the NBA Finals. I'll explain why. We'll talk about the teams ahead of Minnesota and why there's some of these teams have no business being having as short of odds as they do, especially compared to where the Wolves are on FanDuel's odds to win the championship. So we're going to talk about that on today's show. And I'll give a few reasons why the Wolves should be better, a few reasons why the teams ahead of them will be worse than what apparently people currently think about them. And that's what we'll do on today's show. A big thank you here off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. Of course, you can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So here's the deal. We talked about the over-under win total back when they came out. Like, I think it was right after the finals, plus or minus July 1st, kind of mid-free agency, I feel like, is when we first saw the win totals. And by the way, we'll talk about that later. And we'll talk about it. We'll revisit it as we get a bit closer to the season. And I'll talk about my ultimate projection. I traditionally do this in the last show or two shows before the start of the regular season. I've already said I would take the over on the win total. It opened at 50.5. It's now down to 49.5 on FanDuel, and I just don't really understand it. But even crazier than that is the odds to win the NBA Finals. Minnesota is ninth on this list. This is on FanDuel. Of course, our friends at FanDuel, they do a great job, and I'd encourage everybody to check out FanDuel, right? However, these odds are crazy, and I don't really get what I'm looking at. It's not making sense in my brain. And here's where the Wolves are. So OKC obviously is the favorite, right? Plus 220, which is, if you're not super familiar with odds, that's like, they're by far the favorite. They're plus 220. And the next shortest odds is Cleveland at plus 700. And I get that one. Denver, and that's a big difference, right? So 480 points difference. So you got to bet, $100 to win $700 on Cleveland to win the title, $100 to win $220 on the Thunder to win the title. That's the difference there. That's a huge gap. And I get it. Like they're absolutely the prohibitive favorite. I would pick the Thunder right now. If I had to pick Thunder or the field, I think that's a much more intriguing bet, like Thunder or anybody else to win the finals. Fine. That's a close one in my mind because the Thunder are that much better. They were that much better than anyone else in the regular season and in the playoffs. And obviously the finals with the 7 games. But ultimately, they're the favorite. Cleveland at plus 700, Denver at plus 900, the Knicks at plus 950. Okay, I'm with it so far. I'm fine with those being the top 4. And while sitting here right now, I would argue the Wolves are a better team than the Knicks, and you could have the conversation about if they're a better team than the Cavs or not. I would probably still put the Wolves behind the Cavs. You look at the Eastern Conference, and the conference is easier, right? No Jason Tatum. For at least the vast majority of the year. No Tyrese Haliburton at all this year. And the only team that obviously got better would be Orlando, right? In the Eastern Conference. You could argue Atlanta, but are they a real champ? Well, actually, they're close to where the Wolves are in these odds, believe it or not. So you give the Eastern Conference a bit of an advantage because it should be easier if you're a good team to get through that field. The West is rough and tumble. It's going to be a tough thing to come out of the West. So I get it. I understand having the Knicks at plus 950. The fifth best odds to win are the Rockets at plus 1,000. I understand the Rockets having decent odds. That's too high. We'll get back to that. The Lakers are plus 1,400. This one I don't understand at all. I just don't get it. I'll explain more about that later. Orlando's plus 1,700. Absolutely don't understand that one. We'll get back to it. The Clippers at plus 1,800. Same deal. Don't get it. Those are the 8 teams ahead of Minnesota. if you had just told, if I had not looked at this and you'd said, where would the Wolves be in terms of odds to win the title? I would have been like, all right, OKC's ahead of them. Cleveland, yeah. Denver, fine. You could argue the Knicks because they're in the East and they're a really good team. And you could even argue the Rockets because they've gotten a lot better. And I know I've said on this show already, I think Minnesota, if I was picking the order of the West right now, I'd pick Minnesota third ahead of Houston, behind Denver and OKC. Okay. But those are your top five. To have the Lakers, Magic, and Clippers all ahead of Minnesota is just insane to me. I don't get how Minnesota is fourth in the West in odds and ninth overall. Or I'm sorry, fourth in the West, fifth in the West. It's even crazier the more I think about it. Fifth in the West and ninth overall to win the finals. Okay. Now, I've done on this show already a couple of weeks ago. I did reasons why the Wolves will be better this year than they were last year. I do want to do that a little bit later, but I want to start by kind of picking apart why these other teams shouldn't be ahead of Minnesota from the lens of what those teams are. Okay. The West, look, the West is better at the top, but it's not better at the bottom. And why that matters here is, and I'm not convinced it's better in the middle either. Why that matters here is the Wolves have, obviously every team's weighted. They play the West more than they play the East, right? They play 3 or 4 games against everyone in the West and only 2 games against everyone in the East. That's how the schedule works. So if you're in a tougher conference, you're going to play tougher competition. You're going to play everyone in your division 4 times. And it's, obviously OKC's in the West, Denver's in the West. So 2 of the top 3 teams in these odds. And apparently, according to what these odds are, 4 of the top 6 teams in title odds are in the Western Conference. And actually, if you want to include the Wolves, 6 of the top 9 teams are in the Western Conference. So the West is tougher at the top. But look at the bottom of the West. Like, the Kings are worse than they were 12 months ago, right? No De'Aaron Fox, the Levine trade. Like, what are we doing there? They're worse. The Suns are obviously worse. Moving on from Kevin Durant, moving on from Bradley Beal. Like, what is there beyond Devin Booker? Like, it's not going to be a good team. You could argue the Pelicans are worse. They're definitely not better. That's essentially, you look at the Western Conference, the bottom of the West. That matters. Like, those teams being worse, and you could insert a joke here about the Wolves playing down to their competition, and certainly that's a thing. But you can't assume that that's going to be the case when you look at this. And you're like, all right. And I know Sacramento won 40 games last year. They're not going to be a bottom feeder, but they're definitely worse. So you could argue they're in the middle of the West, fine. But Phoenix is going to be the bottom. The Pelicans, and look at the other teams who are the bottom. Like, yeah, the Spurs will be better given relative health from Wemby, and I know a lot of people are picking them to be not an easy playoff team, but like in the top 6 to 8 range, right? I'm fine with that. I'm a little lower on the Spurs than a lot of people are, and we'll get into actual predictions later on in terms of standings and stuff like that, over-unders and all that as we get a bit closer. So the Spurs will be a little better, sure. But the Pelicans will be the same or worse. Phoenix will be worse. Sacramento will be worse. Look at the teams that are going to be the same at best. I mean, Utah's not better. They may try to win. They may try a little bit harder to win this year. Less, quote unquote, injuries and rest nights, maybe. Portland certainly played better at the end of last year, but I don't know that I would say that they're for sure a better team than they were last year. They may win more games because they're trending in the right direction, and they did end up winning 36 last year, but they're not significantly better. Golden State's not better either. And there's a lot of, what's going on there kind of stuff with Curry and Butler and Draymond with the front office and the Kuminga stuff. Like, they always seem to figure it out to an extent. But, like, is Golden State going to be better than 48 wins like they were last year? Probably not. And like, you can look at Dallas, too. Like, I actually kind of like Dallas at this point, and who knows what Cooper Flagg will be. But with a healthy Anthony Davis and eventually a healthy Kyrie, it all kind of depends on what kind of a season they get to start out with. Like, the West is tough, no doubt. But it's not tougher than it was a year ago. And Minnesota added Julius Randle on the eve of training camp, added Dante DiVincenzo on the eve of training camp. And I think it's a pretty clear, you can make a pretty clear argument, and I'm going to in a minute here, why the Wolves will be better this year in the regular season than they were last year. And never mind the fact that the Wolves have, quote unquote, overperformed the last couple of years in getting to the finals. I know 2 years ago they were, the 3 seed when they beat Phoenix, and then they beat Denver, but nobody picked them to beat Denver in the second round. A lot of people picked them to lose to Phoenix. And then last year, nobody thought Minnesota would go to the conference finals. And I know they beat a mostly Steph-less Warriors team. But still, if anything, this team's overperformed in the playoffs. So even if you don't think they're going to win 55 plus games in the West in the regular season, why would, if you're the odds makers or betting against Minnesota to make the playoffs, why would you Why would they be ninth in these odds? It just doesn't make any sense to me. I want to get into some of the Wolves related stuff and a couple more things related to the West. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at 5 Hour Energy. Caffeine just got a flavor upgrade. 5 Hour Energy shots deliver tasty caffeine in 17 bold flavors. Each 2-ounce shot packs the caffeine of a premium 12-ounce cup of coffee, plus B vitamins and nutrients with zero sugar and zero crashes. What I love most is how portable 5 Hour Energies are. Big taste in a tiny shot. You can take it anywhere and get the boost whenever you need it. There's tons of flavors to choose from. Again, 17 of them, and you really can't go wrong with any of them. In addition to how portable they are and the delicious flavors, they kick in extremely fast, plus they're sugar-free, so you don't have to worry about one of those terrible sugar crashes later on. Enough with boring, flavorless caffeine. It is time to give your caffeine a flavor upgrade with 5 Hour Energy shots. Get the favorites you love or be bold and try something new in-store and online at www.5hourenergy.com or Amazon today. That's the number 5, www.5hourenergy.com or on Amazon today. All right, so we talked about the rest of the West. The bottom of the West, New Orleans, Sacramento, Phoenix, all worse. Utah, Portland, Golden State, maybe even Dallas, not necessarily significantly better. Okay. Let's talk about some of the other questions about the teams that are ahead of Minnesota, like in these odds. We can start with the West, actually. Let's start with LA. Both LA teams, for that matter. The Lakers are not better. Like, I understand the idea behind a year of Luka Doncic and you know, having him in the fold for longer. I get that he's in shape. He looked great playing overseas this summer. Fine. I'll give you all that. And yes, I still believe he's a top 3 player in the NBA. I ranked him ahead of Anthony Edwards in the Locked On NBA top 100 players. So by definition, wouldn't you assume that like their team would be expected to be very good? Sure. Yes, absolutely. However, LeBron is a year older. He probably is still a top 20 player. I think I had him ranked around, I can't remember exactly. I had him around 15 on my ranking. That's great. 2 top 15 players, that matters. But you know what else matters is having the rest of a roster. And you could make the argument, and the Lakers clearly believe this, choosing to move on from Dorian Finney-Smith to bring in the likes of DeAndre Ayton, Marcus Smart, and Jake LaRavia. You could argue that's the right move. I think Dorian Finney-Smith is the best of those players, given this version of Ayton, this version of Marcus Smart. It's a bit of a dice roll. And you could argue the ceiling of this team is now a little bit higher, certainly with a healthy, in-shape Luka, you know, more time with his teammates, et cetera. But LeBron's a year older, and I don't know where else this team gets better. Like, they were 19-13 in the regular season after the Luka trade. They obviously lost in 5 games to Minnesota in the first round of the playoffs. And, like, you look at some of the other numbers on cleaning the glass, like they were the 15th best offense in the regular season post-Luka trade, the 17th best defense in the NBA post-Luka trade. I'm surprised the defense was as good as it was. And of course, adding Marcus Smart is going to help you on some level there. But I don't think Ayton's going to help you as much. I know they thought they needed an upgrade, you know, over Jackson Hayes, which, you know, sure, yes, he is. But he's not going to like solve all your problems on the defensive end. And I think over the course of the season, with at least in the regular season, with what you're going to get and not get from night to night with LeBron, I don't know. Certainly the ceiling of the Lakers, you could argue, is a top 3 team in the West because of Luka. But the floor is much lower because of the lack of depth. And not only, so like having them at plus 1,400, I don't hate it. But if you compare it to Minnesota at plus 2,200, is there really an 800-point gap there? Plus 1,400 to plus 2,200. Does that really make any sense? Given the lack of depth on this roster, I mean, the Lakers go basically 6 deep, depending on what you even think about the rest of their starting lineup. And I think losing Dorian Finney-Smith is going to really impact them. Not to mention, and again, I know there's all these buts with Luka in the playoffs last year with the Lakers. But look at what Minnesota did to the Lakers. Like, Luka and LeBron played in that series. It's not like Steph getting hurt and missing the series. So if you even want to look at these teams head to head, DeAndre Ayton's not going to solve the issues Minnesota had the Lakers did against Minnesota with Rudy and Julius Randle and the mismatches that Minnesota created very easily against them. I just don't get it. Let's talk about the other LA team, the Clippers. They're 1 slot ahead of Minnesota. They're plus 1,800. Minnesota's plus 2,200. If the Clippers were 100% healthy, And by that, I mean, if we knew it was going to happen with Kawhi Leonard, we haven't talked about this at all on the show, but obviously there's a chance there's some sort of punishment handed down that impacts the Clippers roster this year. I kind of think it's unlikely. I think Kawhi is going to play. Any penalty I think that Adam Silver hands down is probably a fine plus likely draft picks and or draft pick penalization, penalties, whatever. I don't know that it impacts the roster or the season, but there's kind of this pall hanging over the Clippers, and they've got a good coach. They've obviously got star power with Kawhi. And I don't mind what they did to their roster either. So I kind of get it. I mean, like, I think the Bradley Beal addition's overrated. I think the John Collins, I'm curious to see that one. I think probably the Brook Lopez, Chris Paul additions are underrated, but the Norman Powell departure is also underrated. So I don't really know that they necessarily got that much better, and you can't assume health for Kawhi Leonard. There's just too many question marks with the Clippers. So taking them, I would say similar to the Lakers, the ceiling is probably pretty high here, but the floor is much lower than basically any other team that you're looking at in the top of the Western Conference. And I know they won one more game than Minnesota last year. But what are you going to get from Kawhi Leonard? And what are you going to get from the rest of this roster? Kawhi actually only played 37 games last year, and they still managed to win 50. But also, like, they had the best season that James Harden has played in a hot minute. So, like, what's that going to look like? So, again, too many question marks to have them at plus 1,800. Doesn't make sense to me. The last one, I'm not going to talk about Houston. I've talked a lot about them already. I understand why. Well, actually, the quick thing with Houston is they have better than their odds to win the finals are more than twice as good as Minnesota's, plus 1,000. Why would anyone bet the Rockets plus 1,000 over Minnesota at plus 2,200? I think the Wolves are better than the Rockets. And I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that. I get that they added Kevin Durant. I get that they added old Clint Capella. I don't, and they added Dorian Finney-Smith. Great. But I don't understand how Kevin Durant, who couldn't get out of the first round with the Suns, and I know he doesn't have to deal with Bradley Beal now, and that's certainly going to help. But like, and there's projection with Amen Thompson and Fred VanVleet. If he's like your fourth or fifth best player, that's great. I just don't understand how those odds are more than twice as good as Minnesota's to win the finals. It doesn't make any sense to me. The odds are too short for the Houston. It's just not good value if you're actually betting on this on FanDuel. You would never take the Rockets to plus 1,000. It makes no sense. They should not have the fifth best odds to win the finals. The last team I'll talk about is Orlando, plus 1,700. I don't hate the fact that Orlando is in the top 10 here because, again, the East is not good. The Pacers and Celtics are understandably much lower than them, given all of their, the Celtics Celtics are plus 5,500. The Pacers are plus 10,000 to win the finals. They don't have Tyrese Haliburton, right? So, like, it makes sense. And so I understand why Orlando's higher, but to have them ahead of Minnesota and ahead of the Clippers, for that matter, is just a function of how weak the Eastern Conference is. And they were actually in the last ESPN Power Rankings, which were, I don't know, a month or two ago. Minnesota was ahead of both the Clippers and the Magic, and I said at the time I understood that. All the Magic did was add Desmond Bane, and yeah, they added Tyus Jones, but like Tyus wasn't great last year either. I still don't think they have enough shooting. Like, Bane obviously matters, and Bane's going to make a big difference there. But they also lost KCP. They lost Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. They basically replaced Cole Anthony with Tyus Jones, which I think is probably a net positive for them, but not dramatically so. I don't understand. Like, they're probably, like, sitting here right now, you put them behind the Knicks and the Cavs, of course. If you look at the rest of the Eastern Conference, I don't know. I kind of still would put Milwaukee ahead of them. And you could debate Detroit ahead of them. And Atlanta's in that same conversation. I just don't think that they're dramatically a better option than any of those teams. The next East teams on this list, the Hawks are right behind Minnesota. They're plus 2,700. The Pistons are plus 3,300. The Sixers are down at plus 4,000. Milwaukee's all the way down at 5,500. But honestly, I would take Milwaukee at 5,500 over. I think I'd take them over the Magic at plus 1,700. I understand, like, even odds, you probably take Orlando over Milwaukee, but the gap there in the odds, the Bucks would be better value if you're actually betting on this than the Magic at plus 1,700. I know the defense was good last year, but man, I just don't think adding Desmond Bane and Tyus Jones is going to lift their offense to a level that they're going to be that good to win the championship. It just seems crazy to me. So if I were doing these odds, I would have OKC, Cleveland, Denver ahead of Minnesota. I understand the Knicks. I'd probably have the Knicks and Minnesota in the same place, but I'd have Minnesota ahead of Houston. I'd have them ahead of the Lakers, the Magic, and the Clippers. I think this is nuts. I'll talk about why I think Minnesota will be better. And this is something I talked about a couple of weeks ago. I'll hit a couple of these points pretty quick here, but I have a pretty quick elevator pitch here, technically longer than an elevator pitch, but why Minnesota should be better than their 49 wins last year and you should take the over on the 49.5 on their win total on FanDuel. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Monarch Money. Most people cannot name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. And that's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you put off organizing your finances, Monarch is for you. Monarch does the heavy lifting for you. Hefty lifting as well. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. Again, that's 50% off your first year. monarchmoney.com with the code LOCKEDONNBA. Okay, in short, why Minnesota will be better. Well, first of all, the team's not worse, right? They won 49 games last year. And the only change this offseason was losing Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And that's not great. Yeah, your top 8 becomes a top 7. However, as I've said before, the offensive upside of a team with Terrence Shannon Jr. and even Rob Dillingham in the rotation is greater than that with Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And I know that he had an impact beyond the points per game. Like, we're not simply like, oh, well, points per game, Nickeil. I understand Nickeil had an impact beyond that, right? It was his ability to hit the corner three. It was his ability to run some offense as a secondary playmaker. That's all true. I think TJ Shannon, his impact as a true off the dribble threat and a transition threat, the fact that he can dunk on guys and draw fouls and play with reckless abandon, but yet still enough control, given the small sample, I believe this about TJ Shannon. I think that the plus side on offense might cancel out the negative on defense, because TJ Shannon is not as good of a defender as of right now as Nickeil Alexander-Walker, but the scales, I think, kind of even out there. TJ Shannon is a little better on offense and a little worse on defense than Nickeil, but I think it's going to come out in the wash. And then in addition to that, well, TJ Shannon has the biggest two-way upside of the three guys, him, Dillingham, and Jalen Clark. You need defense. Jalen Clark's a great defender. He's every bit as good, albeit a little smaller, but every bit as good as a pointed attack defender as Nickeil Alexander-Walker. I truly believe that. And Rob Dillingham is a more dynamic, higher ceiling offensive player than Nickeil. I'm not saying he's if you take these guys in the role, Dillingham's not going to be as impactful as Nickeil. But if you're asking if you need some higher variance, some higher ceiling offense, some shooting, off the dribble scoring, Dillingham can do those things, and Nickeil was not great at those things. He could do them. He wasn't great at it. So I think the combination of those three guys, this three-headed monster that will recreate and possibly give you a higher ceiling than Nickeil could do, I really, truly think that's the way to look at this. It's perhaps a lower floor on that spot in the rotation, the 8/9 spot, but it's absolutely a higher ceiling. Nickeil was a known quantity. That's important for a team with championship aspirations, no question. But the upside, the ceiling, again, of having Dillingham, Shannon, and to a lesser extent, Jalen Clark at your disposal, and any combination of those guys is going to play. I think 2 out of 3 of them play almost every night as the 8th and 9th spots in the rotation. Finch has said already the rotation likely expands to 9 guys this year. I think that has a higher ceiling. Okay. So combine that with the fact this team won 49 games last year with a Pythagorean win-loss record of 53. What does that mean? If you're not familiar, you could look at that. You could look at the point differential. Basically what that is a projection of how many games a team with their point differential should have won. And there's historical data to back all this up, like why this is not. I've heard the argument against it, like in baseball, the run differential, like, oh, it doesn't make sense because one game you win by a ton and the next game you lose by. Well, yeah, exactly. It all comes out in the wash is the idea. Minnesota traditionally has struggled I say that. It feels silly if you go all the way back to like the Tibbs years because those were all different guys, a different coach, the whole thing. there is some noise there. And there is some real stuff. Like, yeah, they struggled in the clutch last year. So that does need to improve a little. But they weren't 4 wins worse in the clutch. Like, there were other factors that played into this that made it goofy. So if you get half of that back, you get to 51 wins. If that's like, I think that's a completely reasonable thing without any improvement from Ant, without any improvement in the late game execution on the coaching staff or on the actual roster, the players on the floor. I think if that's your baseline, if just assuming they're not going to be 4 games worse than their point differential last year, I think that's reasonable. I think that's 100% on the table. And that those are like the obvious reasons. I mean, I could get into some of the other things. Like, I think Ant will improve. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Like, we saw him last year come in and just decide he was going to be a better shooter, and he was. Like, I think he'll be better in the clutch. I think he'll be more consistent. I think ultimately he'll be better in the playoffs, which isn't even. I guess we are talking about that related to the finals. The finals odds. I think that's true. I also think that it's undersold how young Jaden McDaniels and Naz Reid are and how many important reps they've had for how young they are. Like, Naz is about to enter the prime of his career, and Jaden's even younger. Like, their relative health, but also the reps they've gotten and the experience that they've gained. They're young veterans that still aren't to their prime. I talked about the upside of the 8-9 spots in the rotation. I talked about the better luck. I think those are all the biggest reasons. Also, the schedule, at least to start the year. They should be able to bank. I think I said in my bold predictions show a couple weeks ago, I thought Minnesota would have 24 wins by New Year's. Like, they could be halfway to their win total over under by New Year's Day. I had them at 24-7. They've got an easy start to the schedule. And if they can bank those wins and hopefully stay, knock on wood, relatively healthy, they play New Orleans, they play Utah, they play Sacramento twice each before New Year's. That's important. They don't have hardly any back-to-backs through December. They have 4 total over the first 2.5 months. So an average of a back-to-back every, what is that? That's 10 weeks, 4 back-to-backs. So every 2.5 weeks, they get a back-to-back. That's not bad at all. They've got a bunch in January, and yeah, the schedule gets tougher. But if they can bank 24, 25 wins by New Year's, that's not a bad spot to be. And that's where I think we're going to be on New Year's Day, is 24-ish wins, plus or minus, and well on their way to winning 50 or more games. And I'll give my final win total prediction in early October, which I guess is like 2 weeks away, actually like a week and a half away. And I think this team should have better than plus 2,200 odds to win the finals this year. Better than 9th best. I think it's nuts. I just think it's crazy. All right. That's all I got for you today. Of course, we are daily Monday through Friday. I'll be back again tomorrow, getting you ready for the start of training camp as it comes up very soon here. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere that includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. A reminder that if you have not checked out any of the shows about the Locked On NBA Top 100, the list came out 2 weeks ago. I talked about it extensively, not last week, but the week before. Every day, I did at least a segment or two, if not a full show, on the Locked On NBA Top 100. Find out where I had players ranked versus the consensus Locked On list. Go check that out. The list, of course, was done by all of our experts who cover these teams and these players every single day. Find the full list on Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, this show is also part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.